just to reiterate this point about that you were flagging, that the leading banks are, they're out there, doubling down and pulling really far ahead of the lagging banks. And as I said before, we're seeing that gap grow between the leading and the lagging banks faster and faster and faster, right? So, you've got to ask yourself, at what point in time can you not catch up any longer?
Most banks, including potentially yours, are falling into a dangerous trap. They're announcing AI initiatives, holding innovation showcases, and talking about digital transformation. But when it comes to measurable business results, 70% have nothing to show for their investment. That doesn't mean that the investment isn't paying off. It may just mean the measurement's not taking place. The winners like JPMorgan Chase, Capital One, and a few others aren't just lucky. They're decoded a specific approach to talent, execution, and measurement that lets them turn AI investments into strategic advantages. Meanwhile, many are still wasting budgets with little or nothing to show for it beyond PowerPoint slides. Today, we're joined again by Alexandra Mousavizadeh, CEO of Evident, who has just released the most comprehensive analysis of AI outcomes in banking. Her team tracked 173 use cases of AI across 50 major banks, and the data reveals a stark divide emerging in our industry. Alexandra will reveal which banks are already using AI to steal retail customers, how they're measuring real ROI, and most importantly, what retail banking leaders need to do differently in the next 12 months to avoid being left behind. If you're responsible for retail banking strategy, customer acquisition, digital transformation, or just the customer journey, the next 30 to 40 minutes will determine whether your bank thrives or merely survives in the AI revolution. So, welcome back to the show, Alexandra. Before we begin, could you reintroduce yourself to those who may not be sure who you are or who Evident is?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim, for having me on again. You had me on the first time just when we had launched the ranking of the banks on their AI adoption, and here we are 2 years later. But very happy to just reintroduce myself to those who didn't listen to the first podcast. My name is Alexandra Mousavizadeh. As Jim said, I am the co-founder and CEO of Evident. And Evident is a benchmark business where we rank financial services on their AI adoption progress. And we rank the 50 biggest banks in North America and Europe, which we've done for now 3 years. And we just recently released a ranking of the 30 largest insurers in North America and Europe just 2 months ago. And we will be releasing a payment platform index and an asset management index and a wealth management index and so on. And we might venture into to sectors outside of financial services at some point. But the financial services are just really a rich area and sector to measure, because there's so much investment going into AI. There's so much data. There's so many use cases. And while it is a regulated sector, there still is a lot to do and a lot that the banks can do. And there's a lot of competition. So it is a bit of probably a winner take all. And to your point before, Jim, what we're seeing for sure is that the gap between the leading and the lagging banks is only growing ever bigger. And so you definitely see that if you're leading a leading bank in AI, what we're seeing in the data at least is that they're only doubling down and they're pulling out much, much further ahead. And so therefore that gap between leading and lagging banks is only increasing. And my background is I've been in the index measurement business all my career at Moody's, at Morgan Stanley. I've run a rating agency, but have for 7 years now measured AI adoption and deployment with the release of the Global AI Index back in 2018. Can you believe it? Where we measured nations on their AI progress, which is still in existence. But when we got tapped constantly from the financial services to ask if we could adapt our methodology to financial services. We pivoted and set up Evident. And that's almost 3 years ago.
So your latest report on outcomes shows that 47 of the 50 largest banks announced 173 new AI use cases in the past year. But the real startling result, which kept on intertwining in your whole report, was that only 30% report actual outcomes. So what's fueling the disconnect between AI announcements and tangible results? Is it simply a reporting issue, or is it maybe that they're not even measuring the results yet?
Yeah, no, I think so. So maybe just to step back, I mean, the outcomes tracker that we've built is based on what the banks are making visible. And so you'll have some banks that are comfortable reporting on everything from what's the actual AI spend to what is the number of use cases to what is the actual ROI in dollar terms. Very few banks do that. JPMorgan does that, DBS does that, and a few others. Then you've got a cohort of banks that are reporting use cases with an associated outcome, which is the ones that you were referencing. And then there are banks that might take a slightly more cautious approach or might not be that far advanced in sort of a central orchestration of measuring impact and sort of the whole gamut of ROI. So I'm more more than happy to talk about the use cases and what they're doing in the bank, because there's so much pressure now from investors, shareholders, and also talent to see what is the bank actually producing. But not maybe quite there yet in terms of articulating a impact in terms of a time saved or a dollar value or revenue uplift, because once that cat is out of the bag, that number will be tested over and over again. So it's not that the ROI is not necessarily there, and we can see it from our private benchmark that we do with the banks, where we get all of the data from the banks on their actual ROI and all of their use cases. So we can, the split is, what are you making public? And their banks are slightly more cautious versus sort of what's actually going on behind the scenes. And there you can see there is actually impact, but you just maybe want to have it run for a little bit further, or you're seeing efficiency gains that you want to actually translate into a dollar value, but you might want to have it run for another 6 months. So we're still very early days. We shouldn't forget this. We're still very early days in shifting AI use cases from, ideation and into production. And then from there to measure the ROI is, only just really starting to have a consistent methodology to measure it in a way that's constantly monitoring the progress and so on. And there's a long way to go. We're just in the foothills of rolling out AI. So we shouldn't forget that there's a very long way to go.
Well, it's interesting. We were talking before we got on air that MIT just came out with a study that looked at the outcomes also, and they came up with very similar results as far as the trending, that there's a lot of initiatives that have not, and I got to be very careful about this because I think it can be misdefined, that they haven't recorded a return on investment yet. And I hate to have financial institutions that are tentative about AI, thinking that means they're not generating results or they're not generating positive results. But again, I think it's a situation that we have to be very careful about the clickbait versus the reality that many are still in the process of understanding how best to measure that. What was your takeaway from the other study?
Yeah, I think two things about the MIT report. I mean, directionally, it was probably accurate. There is, actual tangible financial returns are still, are not, fully coming through yet. Because there's a lot of testing still going on. There's a long way to go in terms of getting use cases into production across functions and lines of business. And we're just in the early days. And as I said before, early days on measuring the revenue uplift or actual, cost savings. So the MIT report was probably directionally right, but it was also very flawed, right? They only looked at the financial gains. They didn't look at other things like risk reduction and customer satisfaction and hours saved that were then used for other things that weren't necessarily translated into dollar values, but but would probably be things that would come through in growth of market share over time, but not taking that into account. And the other issue was that they looked at use cases in production and ROI only in a 6-month time period, which is not enough time to
Right.
actually
Definitely.
identify a realized return. So, either way, there was a lack of understanding of, when do you actually expect to see true value, or it was just a sort of a fault in the study. And therefore, I think we should, it's probably more than 5% that are creating
Yeah.
value.
Yep. It's
But
just how you're
it's
measuring
not.
it. Yep.
It's not, yeah, but it's not 50%. But so, and I think, the interesting thing was also that it had such an impact on the markets. And I know it has been debated a lot when it came out a couple of weeks ago. But that is because the markets are skittish in terms of looking for the evidence that the adoption and the AI deployment at enterprise level is actually happening, because otherwise your Microsofts and your Nvidias and so on that are delivering the tools will not have something to base the high valuations on, if adoption is in fact going to take a lot longer, and the ROI going to take a lot longer than people had anticipated. So when a report like that comes out, it is going to spook people a bit.
So your report showed that the outcomes are finally moving beyond efficiency and back office gains to include revenue growth, which you found had increased to 16% of use cases in the first half of 2025. What's driving this change from what was, I'm going to call, legacy AI utilization and fraud, risk, and back office outcomes and efficiency to the types of use cases that are actually contributing to a better customer experience and revenue growth?
Yeah, I would say it's still a relatively slow shift. I mean, it's a gradual movement away from solely seeing returns from back office, low risk, internally facing Gen AI use cases, which is in the sort of the pipelines of the bank and the functions and the IT functions and fraud and KYC and so on. Well, that's not fully only back office, of course, but that's sort of where the deployment was, a natural place to be initiated, because it wasn't customer facing, with the lack of reliability of the large language models, whichever one you used. You couldn't let it be fully, customer facing. You still can't do that. So deploying it into the back office functions was a very natural way and place to start, right? You want to try and see, can we get our cost to delivery down? Can we make our operations more smooth? Can we take out, drudge work that the analysts are doing? Can we pull in all of this data so we can deliver better, analysis, and put tools in the hands of our investment bankers, our wealth management analysts, our marketing people, and so on. But there will always be a human in the loop. And so, and that hasn't ridden out. I mean, if you ask any bank really about their KYC process, the idea is that you get to sort of 80% of the KYC process automated, but there's no bank that has reached an 80% automation of KYC, of knowing your customer and onboarding your customer. They'll get there eventually. So this is still a lot of room for Gen AI use cases being deployed in functions across the back office still. And there's a lot to be done on things that are more customer facing. Now, the retail banks have a lot of AI already in their customer engagement, but it is very carefully deployed. A lot of guardrails. You got human in the loop, but you do see that functions are being tweaked and tuned. They're being improved, on the margins with Gen AI tools, and that is what we're starting to see. Sort of, there's more and more comfort with that, and that is moving. More and more AI tools are deployed for customer engagement purposes, and so on. And sort of, you're starting to see sort of in areas like trading, where you're seeing deployment of Gen AI that are catching mistakes, fixing them quickly. The pickup in pace and speed of trading, and refining on the edges, that are leading to sort of proper revenue uplift as well. But there are many examples.
So when you look at the internal versus external, you found that 85% of Gen AI use cases are still limited to internal users, you mentioned. What prevents banks, from your perspective, from deploying generative AI and AI solutions more externally? And when do you think this will change?
Well, it comes down to governance at the end of the day, and it comes down to the risks that, and I'm not talking about AI risks, but the risks that banks will be willing to take with their customers of trying out, the sort of the deployment of more sort of AI driven tools. Will they come up with an odd answer? Will it be slightly kooky? Will it be a bit weird? But will it be a bit off? Are they suggesting things that are a bit askew? In addition to, of course, the risks that are there with making decisions if you just leave it without a human in the loop to make decisions on loans and credit lines and mortgages and so on, which I think we're a really long way for having an automated, application and decision made fully on sort of bigger ticket items without a human in the loop, for sure. Not the smaller ones are already very. So you can sort of bucket it into sort of two buckets, which is like the deterministic and the non-deterministic AI. And the deterministic AI is tried and tested. We know that that's still going to move forward. If this, then that. But things that are non-deterministic that can still produce slightly wild answers, we will need to probably see it through a period where they get properly fitted in. So there's no loose answers, that they're properly fitted into the data. So it's just fully only responding to the data that it's supposed to be responding to. And then there's the governance aspect. This is one of the biggest hurdles when we ask the banks around their time to production. This, from an ideation to getting a use case into production has come down drastically when you're looking at low risk internally facing use cases. But when it comes to higher risk externally facing use cases,
Right.
that time to production is still high. And the reason for it being high are threefold. One is data infrastructure. Legacy banks, data is still everywhere. There's a lot of that process and platforming and organization that needs to be done. The second issue is always around resistance. Resistance to changing workflows. Don't want to really do that. If I'm a head of a line of business and I think things are functioning great as they are, do I really want to rethink my whole process flow and put Gen AI or Agentic AI workflows through it? I may, but I may not want to do it today because I'm busy. I might want to do it next month or next year. But the third issue and the third hurdle is always around governance, and especially the model validation side. For Gen AI use cases, that is a big hurdle to overcome, and banks are still very much wrestling with what that might look like. And that goes hand in hand with talking to regulators about what would they be comfortable with,
Right.
with model validation of a Gen AI use case. You validate it and will, by definition, never come up with the same result, which is what you need to have in your model validation, that it is tested and comes up with the same results. So among many other things, but that second line of defense of the model validation is one of the biggest hurdles to overcome when it comes to externally facing Gen AI or agentic AI use cases.
Well, it's interesting because it's the fear of making a mistake. Banking's always been on I'm either all right or I'm all wrong. And yet every way a customer is coming in contact with AI and Gen AI and agentic AI outside the banking industry realizes there's going to be slight errors. Heck, I'm going down the road last night and we're reading our GPS system and it wasn't perfect yesterday. So it didn't know about a couple traffic jams, things that you get very used to. But if you're looking for the perfect solution, which banking often tries to, you can be stuck in the looking for perfection rather than something that can move the needle forward. And I think, especially as we start talking about agentic AI, which is kind of like doubling down on what you think your answer is going to be from an AI standpoint. Your data shows that only 9 of the top 50 banks have a documented agentic AI use case, with just 3, Capital One, JPMorgan Chase, and Bank of New York, detailing supporting architecture. What separates the mindsets or the organizations or the way they do business among those that are starting to dip their toe in that agentic AI use case, which again doesn't have to be the answer to every transaction, every activity a customer takes, but you can use the tools still to move forward? What sets these organizations apart from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about having. I mean, the banks that you mentioned, what do they have in common, right? They're first of all, they're in our, the way we measure, right, and they show up very strongly on our index. They're very high performing banks. They have a very strong talent pool. They have a great experimentation mindset, right? So let's experiment with this. We can see a workflow where agentic AI systems would fit really well on it. Let's try and test that out. And they're narrow projects, right? They're
Yep.
but they're testing it out enough so they can go out and say, we've tested this, but it actually works. We have a specific use case where we've seen agentic AI be, a really good tool set for this. We've worked out how, we get the data in place so it can run over it, and we can apply it. And here's an example of how this would work in our bank. And so, so it does take maturity to be able to onboard something as new as that at the time. This is already 6 months ago in the world of AI. That's a long time ago, and now most banks are experimenting with agentic AI workflows, and so it takes a maturity and that sort of confidence to know what is your process with which that you test, and can you get to a result pretty quickly enough so you can make it visible? And then making it visible is also about putting a stake in the ground. We're so great and we're very good at AI. We've got really strong teams. We want to be showcasing that we're on it in terms of those innovation breakthroughs. So, the next one might be quantum, where we will see quantum inspired solutions to use cases in the banks. But so you want to be showing that you're on the front foot, and that you can test this and come up with a solution and showcase it. Also for talent attraction purposes, also for demonstrating that AI is top of your mind and that you are deeply embedded in the emerging technology. But what sets them apart, is that, central orchestration, extremely strong talent stack, innovation mindset, and also that they pull, all of these banks have in common that they all, they pull the innovation levers that are there for them, right? They've got great AI applied research teams. They've got a lot of patents in and around these topics. They partner with a lot of universities, right? They invest in AI companies. And so all of this are, parts of the playbook that help accelerate the thinking and the deployment of AI.
That's interesting because your report, both this one and the one you published last year around talent, really reinforces the fact that as much as the technology is there, it's still going to take AI talent, humans, to make it work. Deployment is going to be held up if we don't have a good talent stack in our organization. In fact, last year you revealed the direct correlation between the quantity of AI talent and the success of use cases. Now, we can argue which comes first, but in fact, banks with more AI talent report twice as many use cases and were 1.5 times more likely to see an ROI. Is the connection just between talent and outcomes, or does it also include the whole mindset, the culture of generating results from your AI investments and the fact that more people are involved in it?
Yeah, Jim, I think you sort of come right to the crux of the whole problem. Or not the problem, but sort of what is if you were to pick, a leading indicator for a bank successfully deploying AI or being AI mature, it would come down to the talent. Being able to attract the really, the very good talent is really a game changer for your ability to move on AI deployment quickly. Now, if I just step back and just for those who don't know, who are listening, who don't know, talent weighs 45% in the index. So we weigh it heavily. We weigh it heavily because when you look at what it takes for moving, as I say, the use cases from ideation to production, it's all about talent. 10% of it is the technology, but the rest is really the organization, the labeling, the infrastructure of the data, and the talent. Because without the talent, you can't identify the problems, you can't find the solutions, and you can't implement it and put it into production. So we look at 240 role titles within the bank talent stack, and we look at this in the buckets of AI development talent. You've got to have AI model risk talent, you've got to have AI implementation talent, you've got to have AI researchers. And the stronger those buckets are, the stronger that talent stack is, the better your bank will do, right? Because you need your researchers to go and sit side by side with the business leads to figure out where are the areas that we can improve with AI. You need AI development, you need software AI implementation, you need model risk to make sure that you can get it through the governance structures as fast as you can with someone who understands the AI underpinning or the AI model, right? And then you definitely need the AI product management, because otherwise you can't get your use cases into production. We're also seeing now that the leading banks are hiring physicists and pure mathematicians and so on. So, the needs are big, and it's very difficult for banks that don't have that deep AI talent stack to move as quickly because of all of that, the identification, the solving of the problems, the moving it into production, the validation. If you're missing, if you've got gaps in your talent stack in any of that process flow for a use case, it will take longer. And so we see, if over the 3 years that we've run the banking index, that correlation, that the weight of the talent pillar in the index being 45% has been confirmed over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So that's why when you see the banks with the strongest talent stack, and we look at volume and we look at density, i.e. the amount of talent that you have as a proportion of your size of bank, we look at those figures and see that there is that very strong correlation to the outcomes and the ROI. And we see that both in the private data, and it very much tracks in our private data as well.
It's interesting. The banking world continues to love developing reports, developing insights for internal use, where one department can share something with another department, can find out how they're doing internally. My biggest frustration, especially as my understanding of what can be done with AI, is that I don't feel it as a customer. And this is an ongoing challenge. And you've indicated in your research on the talent research, but also in your outcome research, there's a big difference between AI talent that is on the technical data specialist side versus those that are now in the implementation phase. And, my thought is, it ain't nothing till it's deployed. It doesn't matter if it's internal deployment or external deployment, but I think you found that the leaders really are focusing a lot more on getting implementation talent. In other words, what do you do with all this great stuff we found out? And I think that's going to be the key to agentic AI and things of this nature, because the real dollars and cents of this is about how you deploy it internally or externally. And what do you see from that? I mean, what does it tell you about where we are in the maturity wave, not just for the big banks, but in banking overall?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Sort of everyone's guessing, where are we on that maturity curve? Where are we? Are we 5% in? Are we 10% in? I think, what is very clear.
Or does that target continue to change?
Or does that continue to change? And also, look, we spend a lot of time thinking about, what does the bank of the future look like? What does banking look like 5 to 10 years from now? Are the ones that are leaning most heavily into AI, like your JPMorgans and your Capital Ones and so on, are they going to be fully 100% AI? And what does that mean, right? What is, is every function going to be touched by AI, or is it going to be, as we say, augmented by AI, right? Or is it actually going to be, many functions that are completely replaced by AI, so you can do a lot more with less? And so I think that's sort of the big debate that is raging. I think what is clear is that, also looking at other, technical transformation periods is that it goes slowly, and then suddenly you hit a tipping point and it goes really fast. And we're not near that tipping point yet. I mean, if I were to put my head on the block on this, Jim, and I'm sure you would probably ask me to do exactly that, I would say that we're probably still going to be in the slowly until end of 27, early 28. We're going to hit a tipping point by then, and then it's going to be, very fast acceleration of AI adoption, because right now you're seeing use cases going in, sort of pretty much everywhere, but it's still quite light touch. In some areas, it's sort of deeper. In many areas, it's just still, in its very early days. For many reasons, the data is just not strong enough for you to use Gen AI tools on it, externally facing use cases, all of the things that we just touched upon. It means that it just hasn't penetrated that deeply into the banking system yet, but it will. But it is that slowly, and then very, very fast. So I think that was answering your question about sort of what does the future look like, but it is and it's an incredibly interesting thought experiment, which we do all the time. That is sort of, what does it look like 5 to 10 years from now? And the only way you can really answer that is breaking down all of the functions that a bank does and working out, where are the areas where you can replace and where are the areas that you can augment. And then you can try and come up with some kind of an extrapolation.
And it's interesting because more than ever, I believe it's going to be defined by what the customer expects. And I put that in a big umbrella, but the reality is my determination of what my bank should do is determined more by Uber, more by Airbnb, more by Amazon and Netflix and Hulu than it is by another bank, because I don't believe any banks are moving fast enough. What's interesting is your research looks at the top 50 banks, and there's a vast gap between some and others. I'm not even seeing the biggest and smallest, albeit Chase does have a clear advantage in many ways in the way they do things. And there's certain organizations like a Capital One, you're going to say no big surprise there. But I think what's more surprising and more eye-opening for the industry as a total, from top to bottom, not just 50, but beyond that, is that nobody's way far ahead in such a way that, geez, I got all the answers. And it's certainly not divided equally among even the top 50 banks. I think what's interesting also, what I see, is the innovation, the idea set, the way organizations do it are happening within some of the biggest and some of the very smallest, because they've found a way to leverage third-party solution providers to provide them the AI talent on a episode by episode basis, even with regard to the management of the data. These third-party providers say, tell you what, we can take your data and make it applicable to an agentic AI solution that may not be perfect. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, Grasshopper Bank introduced a brand new small business solution. I'm going, holy crap, in certain ways it's here. But they were very clear that they're willing to take chances, say, we may not have the answer complete, but we're going to include the customer in that decision. When agentic AI may be great, but I think the first wave is going to be, here's something we found. Let us know if you want us to complete that transaction or that event or that transfer, whatever it may be. But I think it's very interesting that nobody's way far ahead within the masses. There's many in the middle section of asset sizes that aren't there yet. But you're finding with your research, both on the talent and the outcomes, that the answers as to how to get to be one of the most dynamic, most progressive AI organizations are getting clear. The answer book is a lot clearer than it was 2 years ago when we last met. So I'm going to put you in a situation you're now going to be in charge of, or consulting to, which I know your organization doesn't do, but consulting to a mid-sized to small organization, let's say $10 billion of assets. What are 2 to 3 things that this type of organization must do today? Because they can't just sit by the wayside saying, not me, because there are solutions out there. What do you suggest to them?
Yeah, no, it's thank you, Jim. That's a great question. Maybe just before diving into answering the question, just to reiterate this point about that you were flagging that the leading banks are, they're out there, doubling down and pulling really far ahead of the lagging banks. And as I said before, we're seeing that gap grow between the leading and the lagging banks faster and faster and faster, right? So, you've got to ask yourself, at what point in time can you not catch up any longer? Because if you are up against banks that have poured a lot of money, focus, resource, iterating model, operating models for 5, 6, 7, 8 years at some point, right? Then there's a lot of efficiency gains that will be they will have made, their cost to delivery will have come down, their revenue uplift from AI will be up there. So it's going to be really hard for you to compete as a bank unless you have circumstances around in your market that means that you're ring fenced for whatever reason. It's going to be really hard to stay in business. So I do think it is existential if you don't focus on this. So to answer your question, if you're about to focus on this, what should you focus on? And I would say you've got to focus on everything, right? You've got to get every single bit of this.
No relief. Yeah.
No, there's no rest for the weary, and definitely don't think you're going to get any sleep, because it is, often there's a question like, what are the 3 most important things? But that's hard to answer, because actually it's an ecosystem, and you've got to get all of the components right. And then you've got to keep leading it, and you've got to lead it hard. And you've got to, as a CEO of a bank, you've got to be living, breathing every night, every weekend, every day. What is possible in your business? And are you pointing every single soul in your business to thinking about AI? Are you aligning your heads of lines of business bonuses against, AI results? Are you thinking about the best orchestration where you're centralizing certain things, but you're federating other things? Can you build a hub and spoke system for your bank that allows for, nimbleness, right? These are things that are lessons that we are seeing off the leading banks, that you need a hub and spoke system. You need to have applied AI researchers. Whether you're a big bank or a small bank, you absolutely have to have that. You have to have your talent pool. You have to have your innovation levers. You need to partner with the ecosystem. You need to go to the universities and say, I got this problem, let's do let's sponsor a PhD program for you to solve that. I need to attract that AI talent. I need to be out at the academic conferences, right? I need to be shouting from the rooftops that this is what we're doing, because otherwise my shareholders are going to start questioning what I'm doing, right? And you don't want to, lose that confidence. You also need to attract that talent. And then you need to sort of obviously be quite visible around that. Your governance structures are solid. So as you're putting use cases through to production, you're doing it in a way that doesn't sort of tip the apple cart. So you've got to do everything. There's not one bit that you can't do. You can't have great governance and no talent. You can't have all talent and no innovation, right? You just have to have all the bits in the mosaic before it makes up the picture. And so my advice is, it's everything. You got to focus on that. And that's what we're seeing. Even the leading banks that are far ahead, this is what they're doing. And the banks that are fast followers are saying, oh, we better catch up. This is what they're doing.
So there's laggards in your top 50. There's organizations that you can see report after report after report aren't there.
Yes.
If you were to name one thing that you, in your gut again, because sometimes it doesn't come out on paper as much as you peeling back the layers and saying, wait, I'm seeing something here that seems to be consistent from a hurdle standpoint, from a not getting it. What is that one thing?
Well, I would say what we've seen is that the banks that have been sitting lower in the index and would admittedly say, yeah, we haven't really focused on it. The minute that they pick the sort of the 1, 2, or 3 super strong, great hires, that sort of just, you get the right top talent in, that's going to drag everyone with them.
Yep.
Right. That then attracts further talent. It inspires the teams to think in ways that they haven't. And that can be done with not that many resources. Get the top
mindset.
team in, Go,
Yep.
go find them, bring them in, say, we're ready to change. Tell us what to do, and let that flourish. Then a lot of things will fall into place. And then you've also just got to be, as a CEO, you got to be comfortable and happy with saying, this is what we're doing now. This is why we're hiring these people. And this is, we're doing a step change. So I think that is important.
Look what the leaders are doing in the world today. Look how people are being stolen from one organization to another organization. Now, mind you, this is a different level. This is a different industry. It's the overall think tank. But what's happened is people realize at the end of the day, they're not hiring the best data scientists. They're hiring the best implementers. So people are actually going to move forward. And as it is with any type of innovation, it's only going to happen if the leadership and culture align. Mm-hmm. You're only going to hire the best talent if you have leadership and culture in place. And for lack of a cliche term, if you know what your North Star is going to be, if you really know what you're trying to achieve, even if it's in a composable solution, even if it is one part of the whole data set you want to work with, I think it's important because your studies continue to show that not everybody's got it. Nobody's got an insurmountable lead when it comes to the customer-facing component. So as far as a competitive scenario, I think we've seen that there's a ton of opportunity in the revenue side, which people are just scraping the surfaces of. And we didn't get into it too much here because I think it's very clear. Not enough organizations are measuring the results in a cognitive way that can move the needle from somebody going, oh, by the way, we got to do more of this. They're moving more cautiously because they haven't measured it. And I think, if you don't know what you're going to measure on the front end, you're never going to measure it later because you don't know what to measure. So you have to know your North Star. I think, overall, for those who are listening to the podcast today, you have to look at the future of banking in an AI-driven world in a multiple contexts. You need to maybe take on the podcast or the event I did in Abu Dhabi, where I unpacked what's next for financial services in an AI-driven world. And we always have a lot of podcasts on what's it going to look like in the future of a banking transformed mindset and in leadership to make it go forward. Alexandra, thank you so much for your time today. You again brought a ton of insights. It won't be this long again because you keep on coming out with more research that I think reinforces what we see and what we feel, that there's a ton of potential, a ton of opportunities, but we're kind of sometimes held back by our own legacy thinking on, do we really want to dip our toe in that water? The risk is not that great in context. We have more than enough excuse. We can always blame it on regulation and compliance. The reality is those steps, we're not there yet. We're still doing baby steps. Do the baby steps. At least move forward. Because otherwise, as you referenced, you're moving backwards.